Welcome everyone to our webinar today entitled Setting Baselines for Planning and Evaluation of Efficiency Programs. This webinar will run for about 75 minutes, during which time we'll have 4 presentations. All of your phone lines for you, the audience, are muted. If you have any questions, please type them into the text box and we'll do our best to get them answered today. The webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab LBL webinar website, listed on this slide and other slides of the presentations, perhaps as early as later today. And before we get going, I want to mention that this webinar is from the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. It's providing the funding. And LBL is coordinating the series with input from and in collaboration with DOE, as well as the U.S. EPA, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and the National Association of State Energy Officials, whom I want to all thank for their support. Please let me start off the webinar by introducing myself. My name is Steve Schiller, and I'm an affiliate with the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I've worked in the energy industry for over 30 years, with a great deal of that time focused on efficiency, demand response, and distributed generation. And one of my areas of expertise is in evaluation, measurement, and verification, or EM&V, and I'm fortunate to be the facilitator for this webinar series. LBL, which is hosting these webinars, is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy to conduct non-classified research, and LBL is operated by the University of California. LBL also, with the funding from the Department of Energy, provides technical assistance to states, primarily state energy offices and utility regulatory commissions. Before I say a few words about this technical assistance in the next slide, though, let me mention our disclaimer here, which essentially says that DOE, LBL, the University of California, and pretty much anyone who's ever known me or ever will know me takes no responsibility for what I'm going to say or what our other speakers are going to say today. So this technical assistance that LBL provides is intended to be independent and unbiased for state utility commissions, state energy offices, tribes, and regional entities in a wide range of areas such as energy efficiency and DR and renewables and grid topics. Contact information for the technical assistance is available via the websites listed here. And for those who don't write too fast, again, these slides will be available on the LBL EM&V webinar website, again, hopefully by today or tomorrow. And for that, if you don't have the site, you can just Google LBL EM&V webinars and you'll get to the site. So, whoops, sorry, bumped ahead here. So the webinar series, these webinars are designed to support activities for documenting energy savings and other impacts of energy efficiency programs. As mentioned before, it's funded by the Department of Energy in conjunction with EPA and NARUC and NASIO. And our target audience for these is utility commissions, state energy offices, environmental departments, and nonprofits involved in operating energy efficiency portfolios. We also see as value to many others, and certainly all welcome. We expect more webinars on EM&V topics, and they'll be noticed on the webinar site. Again, contact information is listed here. And actually, we have 2 webinars that are being developed right now. The next one will be in September on evaluating behavior-based programs. And then in October, we'll have one on transmission and distribution efficiency programs with a focus on evaluating one category of T&D efficiency, which is conservation voltage reduction. And yes, that's kind of a creepy picture. I probably won't use that one again. It's on this slide. So for today's webinar, I will start off with the presentations myself by doing introductory considerations and common practices for defining baselines, which is obviously a key aspect of efficiency EM&V. Then our other speakers will provide examples of first addressing market baseline studies. That'll be Rob Ozark from Michigan. And then setting baselines for retrofit measures, and that'll be presented by Carmen Best from California. And then market transformation program baselines with Jeff Harris of the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. We may have time for clarifying questions after each of the 4 presentations, and are scheduled to have time for panelists to address your general and specific questions for approximately the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar. And again, just as a reminder, all the phone lines for you, the audience, are muted. If you have questions, please type them in the text box. And Again, the webinar is being recorded with the recording and slides available soon at the LBL website. Okay, so let's get going with my first one. Again, if you might be joining us a little late, my name is Steve Schiller. I'm an affiliate with LBL. I'm making this first presentation on basics of energy efficiency baselines. So the impacts of interest and the related metrics associated with efficiency are many, but the ones of most interest are typically energy savings or demand savings or avoided pollution. And when calculating the impacts associated with energy efficiency activities, such as energy savings, the basic equation is as shown here, again for the example of energy savings, with savings equal to the energy used without efficiency minus the energy used with efficiency. Or put another way, the energy savings are equal to the baseline energy use minus the observed energy use after the efficiency activity takes place. Thus, baselines are pretty fundamental to evaluating impacts. Baselines are the conditions, including energy consumption and demand, which would have occurred without implementation of the subject efficiency activity. Baselines can also include definitions of non-energy metrics that are also being evaluated, such as air emissions and jobs, for example. So in a simple example, if the efficiency activity is replacing an old motor, the baseline is the energy that would have been used by the old motor under the same conditions as the new motor operates. A few other points here from this slide. Baseline conditions are sometimes referred to as business as usual conditions and are also used to calculate measured project and program savings. Baselines are also described perhaps more formally as the counterfactual scenario, and more on that in another slide coming up here. So why does one have to determine baselines? And the fundamental answer to that is because savings cannot be measured. You don't measure savings. So what we have with this slide here is a graphic of an energy consumption over time before, during, and after an efficiency project is installed. So I'm going to try my little markers here. Let's try and get them to work here. So in this period here where they're putting the red dots, this is the energy consumption in a building before the energy use, and then there's a project installed, and then there's a period of time here where the energy consumption hopefully goes down, and that's conveyed as that black line on this graphic. Now, in order to figure out what the savings are, we have to predict what would have been the energy consumption, that red dotted line above, not the red dots that I unfortunately stuck on this graphic here. That red line above there is the estimated energy use without the project, the baseline. And so the blue shaded area is the energy savings. This is not something that we can measure. We can only measure energy consumption, which in this case is the black line, and we have to predict what that energy use would be, the red line there on the top. So some key takeaways from the slide are: 1, measures energy consumption. You do not measure savings. 2, it's critical to find a baseline, or the business as usual, or the counterfactual to determine savings. And typically, thirdly, for energy savings, one adjusts the energy use in the baseline period to match conditions in the reporting period after the efficiency action takes place. So I mean by that, for example, is you would typically use the weather conditions that occurred during the reporting period, this period on the right side of the graphic, that occurred during to estimate what the energy use would have been in the baseline period. So you take the conditions operating during the time in which you're measuring energy use after the project, and that is the basis for determining your estimate, what would have occurred in the absence of the efficiency activity. So I mentioned counterfactual before, and another way to look at savings estimates is with the idea of this counterfactual scenario. That what would have happened, the what would have happened scenario. With this household efficiency example, this is what we're showing here in this graphic. And this is a similar concept to how prescription drugs are tested. You essentially have a treatment group and a control group. And the control group is the baseline, and we'll actually be talking more about actually these control groups in our next webinar on evaluating behavior-based programs, where the use of control groups is very common. So in this graphic here on the right with the green column, we have households in the program who are participating, say whole house retrofits. This is their energy use. and then you come up with similar households, same time period, but they don't have that, and so looking at the difference in their energy consumption. Another way to get to this baseline, or in this case, what we would call a counterfactual. So sorting out baselines is one of the two big issues of EM&V. In my work, I like to describe two key issues associated with EM&V of energy efficiency. The first is the regulator's dilemma of how good is good enough, how to find the right balance of accuracy and cost of implementing. This was discussed in our first webinar in this series on planning EM&V, and it's the point made here on the left column. The second question I phrase as compared to what? Is about counterfactuals, and our focus today is on that first bullet in this slide's second column, and it's with respect to baselines for specific measures, projects, or programs. So, as compared to what would happen at this particular site, for example. But there's also another as compared to what that I want to mention here, and that's in the second bullet in the second column there, and that's comparing energy efficiency with other activities that can meet energy resource requirements. So thus, one could say that with efficiency, we're actually evaluating two counterfactuals. What would have consumers done, and what would have resource planners done without efficiency? Another general point I want to bring up in these introductory slides is about net savings, which are the attributable savings in a lot of utility demand-side management type programs. And attributable savings or net savings are closely connected with baseline determination. So with these utility type efficiency programs that are funded with utility customer funds, there tends to be two general metrics used for describing the energy savings, the gross savings and the net savings. The net savings are those changes in energy use that are attributable to a particular energy efficiency program or an activity. Now, baselines are that counterfactual scenario indicating what would have occurred in the absence of the program. Since net savings are the savings that can be attributed to the program, one can see that there's a linkage here. For example, if a baseline is defined as the product the average consumer would buy, then almost by definition, the savings calculated on average account for at least a portion of the factor of this thing called free ridership. So the caution here that I want to mention is that baselines and net or gross savings metrics should be considered together with clear definitions when determining impacts and reporting the savings. So while the previous slides might have raised some issues and created some concern because of the issues associated with baseline, the good news is that the efficiency industry has been working on these issues for about 30 plus years, and it's established some pretty standard practices. This slide and the next one lay out the standard practice options for defining baselines. So we have existing condition baselines, which are the equipment controls, procedures, etc., that are in place at the project site before the efficiency measures are implemented. This is a perspective that usually the consumers have themselves. Then we have a common practices baseline, which are estimates of what a typical consumer would have done, with an example here about refrigerators. The two other common ones are codes and standards baselines. These are associated with the buildings or specific pieces of equipment that meet certain legal requirements. Again, the example here is for a motor. A standards baseline might be the minimum requirements of the Federal Energy Independence and Security Act. And then the last category of baselines that are typically used is this minimum efficiency baseline. That's either the codes and standards baseline that's mentioned on the first bullet in this slide, or the minimum efficiency on the market, maybe the common practice baseline was mentioned before for new equipment. So these four tend to be used throughout programs in the U.S. So now you might ask, so which one do I use? And you get the famous engineer's answer of it depends. In this table, the first column are some examples of common efficiency activities, and as you can see, the baseline categories described in the prior two slides can be applied, and the savings analysis varies based on what type of activity takes place and the length of the analysis. For example, for early replacement projects, that is, for example, taking out equipment that is working just fine and putting in efficient equipment, more efficient equipment, when the new equipment has, say, a life of 20 years. Then the analysis might use an existing conditions baseline for the remaining life of that replaced equipment, the equipment that was working fine but's been replaced. Say that's for 5 years, the estimated remaining life of that equipment. And then the codes and standards or common practice or minimum efficiency baseline for the remaining life of the installed equipment, say for the next 15 years after that first 5-year period. These are sometimes called dual baselines, and I believe Carmen is actually going to mention these again when discussing the California protocols. So with that, I'm going to be concluding my presentation, listing here some resource websites available for you. Again, these slides will be available for you to download. And so they're here and available for you. Like I said, there's a lot of work that's been done over the last 30 years or so to help deal with these issues. So with that, let me turn to our next speakers. Our first presentation will be by Rob Ozar of Michigan on market baselines, and then Carmen Best on baselines for program evaluation, and then Jeff will be talking about market transformation baselines. So with that, let me please introduce Rob Ozar. Rob is the Assistant Director of the Electric Reliability Division of the Michigan Public Service Commission. He has over 35 years of experience in the regulation of public utilities. And over the course of that career, has been responsible for issues relating to many facets of that utility regulation, including managing the energy efficiency section at the Michigan PSC. Rob has a bachelor's and master's degree in chemical engineering and is also a licensed professional engineer. And with that, Rob, let you take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, my name is Rob Ozar, and what I'd like to share with you this afternoon is the Michigan experience with market baselines. But in many ways, really what I'm sharing with you is my own personal journey with these studies. Quite a few years ago, I first came into contact with market baselines, and I really didn't know what they were used for. And over the course of working with our own state's early implementation of energy efficiency programs, I've come to a much better understanding of what they are and how they are used, and I would like to share that with you. So in Michigan, what we took really was a multi-year process, and we started with the market baseline studies that were done over a several-year period, and from that, we used that as input to a energy efficiency potential study for the state of Michigan that was prepared by GDS Associates. That study then took us into we entered into a contract with Optimal Energy to write a report on establishing energy efficiency targets for the state over the period 2016 to 2020. And that was followed by an additional report that was called Readying Michigan to Make Good Energy Decisions. And finally, over the past 2 years, we've had legislative discussions at the Michigan legislature. But really what I want to get at here is, in this process, the baseline itself, the purpose of that baseline that we started with was to uncover how energy is used in the state of Michigan. That was input into a statewide potential study, and the purpose of that study was really to elicit what savings opportunities exist in the state. We took that information then, and through the options report, we translated the potential study into a practical plan, a regulatory plan that was based upon the information of that potential study. And then the Readying Michigan report really provided context. In other words, how energy efficiency fits into state policy goals. So let's dig a little deeper. So let's look at the context of the market baseline study. Its end goal is to reestablish Michigan utility resource targets. Now, this is the area that I'm really going to focus on in my presentation. I will acknowledge, though, that market baselines have other purposes too, and they're especially useful for utilities who are implementing energy efficiency programs to develop those programs. but I'll be focusing on my work as a regulator and how we use these market baselines to ultimately end up with recommendations for statewide energy efficiency targets. So a market baseline is like a chemical feedstock. And I know Steve mentioned that I was a chemical engineer, so I've got to throw some chemistry into my presentation. An example I'm showing here is some chemicals that no one is probably aware of. They have no independent practical value. TDI, toluene diisocyanate, is not really well known for anything on its own. But if you mix it with the right reactants, you can make polyurethane, and that polyurethane can make a really exciting skateboard, for example. And this analogy really is what is really similar to what's happening with market baselines. The market baseline is an input. It's like a chemical input to a potential study. It's combined with various other sources of information. I've given some examples here, like a utility retail sales forecast, an avoided cost projection, a TRM, measure savings database. In Michigan, we call it the Michigan Deemed Energy Savings Database. And there's federal information from the EIA, the Residential Consumption Survey, and the commercial CBEX, Building Energy Consumption Survey. These are examples of things that are combined with the market baseline data to create the potential study. And then from that potential study, you can define utility targets, and lo and behold, you get measures installed. I would mention that, this is something that I first recognized when I looked and really take a look and read through a market baseline. It really consists of a set of tables. They can be rather boring to read. So let's look a little bit deeper at how we can take these set of tables, understand what's in those, and make use of them in a potential study. So what is a market baseline study? Well, it consists of two major components. One are on-site audits. These are quantitative. We're looking at building envelope and electric equipment and plug load. We're also doing telephone surveys to get some qualitative understanding of energy customers, how they make decisions, knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and perception. So those are the two components of a market baseline study. Now I put a flow chart up here, and let's take an example of, a restaurant. That could be, say, one of these building types. Of the various end uses, we might look at cooking as one of the end uses, and then the equipment that's used in cooking might be an oven, for instance, or a fryer. So that's how the flow of information in the baseline study would go. So let's look at the next one. The market baselines were done for the residential and the commercial customer classes. These were separate studies that were done for each of those sectors. In the industrial sector, especially in Michigan, it was difficult to do a standard baseline analysis because of the diversity in the buildings and the usage in those buildings. So we focused strictly at the residential and commercial sectors. In the residential sector, were three building types that we looked at: single-family homes, multifamily, and manufactured or mobile homes. In the commercial sector, we looked at 9 market segments, really 8 with 1 miscellaneous. Now the baseline studies were done across the state. We did residential site visits. Just a second, I'm having trouble getting the slides advanced. There we go. So the baseline studies were geographically distributed throughout the state of Michigan. Just for context, I should mention that Michigan has about the area of the United Kingdom. It's just slightly larger than the UK, but the population of Michigan is about 1/6 that of the UK. There's about 10 million people in the state of Michigan. So in our baseline studies, we did 1,069 residential site visits, and we did 289 commercial site visits. Now you might think that that's not a lot considering the population of the state of Michigan. There's 10 million people in the state. But market baselines are very expensive. These site visits cost a lot of money. So you would never go out and do 10,000 site visits, for instance. This really wasn't sufficient amount to get the quality of data that we needed. And it did cost a lot of money just to do these. We also did over 2,000 telephone surveys to get the qualitative data we needed. So the usage characteristics that were looked at in these site visits are listed on this slide. Residential and the commercial on-site audits. Many similar characteristics. Building envelope was looked at in both heating and cooling, lighting, and then there were some differences you can see in the slide. I won't go through all of them, but these are the various usage categories that were looked at in our on-site audits. So let's look now at some key terms that are found in a market baseline. There's actually three terms that are common to all market baselines, and these are core to the tables that are created in a baseline analysis. The first definition is penetration, and that's the number of buildings with at least one unit over the total number of buildings. Saturation is the total number of units over the total number of buildings, and the mean units is the ratio of the two. So that's the number of units for buildings with at least one unit. And the core tables in a baseline analysis measure these data. An example of penetration data is in this table 15, which came from Michigan baseline analysis. And here you can see that the penetration data was given for every single market segment in the commercial sector. The telephone survey looked at these 5 areas: the interest and importance of energy efficiency, drivers for energy efficiency interest, awareness, barriers, and likelihood to adopt energy efficient technology. Here we're looking at a figure 75, which were barriers to energy efficiency, and I'm pointing out that price, for instance, was something relevant. As we look through this, 41% of the survey customers strongly agreed that price was the biggest reason why they might not buy a high-efficiency item. And so that might indicate that rebates and rebate levels are important, and also financing options. So how is the baseline study used in a potential study? It was used in 2 ways. In the residential sector, the baseline analysis provided a bottom-up approach to estimate energy efficiency potential. In the commercial, we did a top-down approach. So let's look a little closer at the residential energy savings. The savings potential was divided up into the 3 market segments we talked about earlier: single-family homes, multifamily units, and manufactured housing. So let's drill down into the single-family homes and look a little closer. Steve talked about building blocks, and here we have the building blocks that are used to take data from a market baseline and develop the technical potential. So we have a block here, a number of single-family homes, the base energy use by technology, and then 2 blocks that come directly from a market baseline, the fuel type distribution and saturation by technology. Actually, the fuel type distribution may or may not be used depending on how the data is presented for the saturation technology. But the product of those 4 is the energy use associated with the inefficient equipment. To that is applied a technical factor and then a measure level savings. This is the delta that Steve talked about earlier. This may come from the technical resource manual. Then the economic potential is determined by relating this to the cost of an alternative resource In other words, the supply side options, which would be, an example might be the levelized cost of new generation. The achievable potential has a few more components. After the technical potential goes through a cost-effectiveness screen, then there's two more blocks that are applied to it, and those are informed also by the market baseline. The first is the long-term market penetration, and that's based on incentive levels, and the second is the year-by-year market adoption curve. Penetration data is used to inform these, and also survey data can help inform these curves. Here's an example of a table that came out of the Michigan potential studies showing the maximum adoption rates. On the bottom left-hand corner, for instance, are water heater heat pumps. And here you can see with a 50% incentive level, for instance, you get a maximum adoption rate of 60%. That then would be applied to a market adoption curve similar to the one that we show on the right, which comes from a Bass diffusion curve. So finally, let me tell you my observations that come from the data from the Michigan baseline analysis. We really learned, the first point was really that adoption of new technologies can be lightning fast, and we saw this with LED lighting. Within just 2 years of that baseline analysis, we saw that the data was really stale and we needed to use different data in a potential study. We also saw that the building stock in Michigan has highly inefficient building envelopes in the commercial sector. There's really little to no insulation in many of the commercial buildings in the state. We saw that ground source heat pumps are a promising technology, but there's little penetration in Michigan. And in the whole process, and one of the first slides I showed you was the process that we took in Michigan before we came to our legislative discussions. In that whole process, we really learned that getting stakeholders included in the process is really critical to getting the studies accepted as really an authoritative source of data. And lastly, and updating the baseline analysis can help identify the market effects resulting from implementing the efficiency programs in past years. I'll leave you with a couple of links to our Michigan market baseline, both the residential and commercial baselines, and I want to thank you very much.
Hi, Rob. This is Steve again. Thank you very much for that presentation. I did have one clarifying question that came in. Is there cost data available within these documents? Is that public and available?
That's something I'll have to look into. It may be in the potential study. The cost data was not in the market baselines, because that was really looking at the penetration and saturation and other types of how energy is used in the state, and not really looking at the cost.
Would the potential studies be available on the Michigan PSC's website?
Yes.
Yeah, that'd be great. So I would, encourage for the person that asked that question perhaps to search the Michigan PSC for the potential study, or to let me know the EM&V webinar. If you're having difficulty finding that, we can find that site for you. So great. So Rob, again, thank you very much for your presentation. And now we're going to move on to further west in our country to California with Carmen Best. Carmen leads the Energy Efficiency Commercial Program and Evaluation Team at the California Public Utilities Commission. Carmen has played an active role in shaping California energy efficiency evaluation and has oversight responsibility for commercial energy efficiency programs. While at the Commission, she has focused heavily on the core elements of evaluation inputs and output, data and reporting. She currently oversees the prioritization, planning, and execution of California's largest energy efficiency research portfolio. And like our prior two speakers, including me, Carmen also has both bachelor's and master's degrees. So with that, Carmen, if you could take it from there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Steve. It's an honor to be invited to share some insights about baselines from here at the CPUC. And since Steve covered many of the basics on baselines, my goal of this presentation is really to remind and reinforce that there are many resources for thinking about baselines, and ultimately it is worth taking the time to think critically about it. So in my presentation today, I'm going to start with some of the definitions and references that are really important to defining baselines and have been developed through lots of back and forth here in California over the past 30 years. Then I'm going to talk about the sources of information for defining baselines in two types of situations, both retrofits, but one is for predefined savings estimates and the other for custom situations. And then I have citations for some of the key documents that are shaping the baseline discussion right now in California. But given that they're actively being debated, I have some limits on how much I can discuss. And then finally, I want to go through some hopes that I have for the future, and that includes some thoughts about baselines. You'll see in my slides that I have links to documents throughout, so hopefully those will be accessible on the slides that are made available. So I wanted to start with the California Evaluation Framework. This document was developed to really lay out some best practices for evaluation, but it also serves as a really important reference for all measurement type activities. It's one of my favorite documents, reference documents for energy efficiency, because almost no stone was left untouched in developing this document. It tapped some of the greatest experts at the time, and many of them are still working in the field right now. It's very comprehensive. It's several hundred pages, and it's been a helpful reference over my career for that reason. The other thing I really like about it is that it's policy agnostic to a large extent. So I went back as I was preparing for this presentation, and it struck me that baseline as a word is cited many, many times in that document. But when you go back to the glossary, it's really broken down into 4 components, which really illustrates the fact that a baseline is really a composite of 4 pieces. First, the information that you need, the data, the baseline data, then the projection and expectations that you have for the forecast in the future period, and then how you're going to be defining your system to model or set the time frame in which those savings are going to be happening. So you don't really have a baseline without taking into consideration each of these different components. In California, we have another document that's really important that is called the Policy Manual. And this document is really has a lot of information about how to define a specific baseline. It's a compilation of Commission direction and rulings which help our program administrators and Commission staff to implement the policies. And it too is chock full of references to baseline as a term because baselines is obviously fundamental to estimating energy savings before the intervention. What you'll find in this document is that since most of our energy savings activities right now overseen by the CPUC are still measure specific, or they're a specific technology that is predefined or deemed savings, it's really critical that you line up all these different situations and conditions when you're defining the baseline. And it's also interesting to note that over the past 10 years, this diligence in trying to define our baselines correctly, we've found that over time we've had less of a gap in our predefined savings estimates from deemed savings to the trued-up savings estimates that are based on our field data. When about 10 years ago we had about a 60% gap from our projected savings to our evaluated savings, and we're now down to about a 20% gap, which is still fairly big, but it's not as big as it was before. And it's no surprise in California that we're not shy about digging into some of the details. If you look, these are just some examples. It's pulled out of the policy manual. There's many more pages in there and other supplemental documents that help define baselines for every single measure that's at play in the portfolio. But we we take seriously the considerations of how you treat replace on burnout or early retirement. And one of the concepts that emerged from this was defining a dual baseline, for example, wherein you're trying to characterize the situation of the effect of a program resulting in an early retirement of a technology. And so we model that in 2 different time periods. I won't get into all the details, but if you are interested in that, we have a lot of documentation on that. The policy manual also has a helpful guideline, which is kind of what type of information is needed to set the guidelines around justifying a baseline. This decision tree in this slide kind of shows some of those choice points. And if you want a bigger version that you can actually read, the link to the policy manual is on the prior page. It's important to note that the burden of proof in our regulatory structure is on the program administrator. They need to provide the information and the logic and the documentation behind their assumptions that are justifying the baseline. So Steve gave lots of examples. One would be if you have a program that's intervening in new construction, clearly code would be your baseline, and the program logic would have to be demonstrating how you would be going above and beyond that to generate savings. Other programs might have things like a standard practice baseline, and that requires a lot of discussions around intent and the logic of the program intervention, as well as what might have been found at the site, as well as sometimes discussions about decision making at the organization. Custom for industrial processes and things like that, those assessments also require significant engagement and discussions to try to get it right. And that's largely because they're custom, and the different situations that present themselves in the field are unique. So that plays right into how baselines are never simply black and white, because there's multiple components that you have to consider, and they need to be kind of in agreement of sorts. But after something happens, you have a little bit more information to work with, so you can improve some of the data components that you might have. But of course, you still have to forecast, you have to model, and then you have to track for a period. So the information that you're really going to be getting from your field evaluation activities are threefold. One is to verify that the agreed upon methods or approaches were actually used. The second one is you have an opportunity to true up some of the assumptions, either generalized or specific ones based on what is observed in the field. And you have to do that by getting representative results, of course. And then you can use that to recalibrate either your unit energy savings for your deemed savings estimates or your gross realization rates for the situations for custom activities. So in some cases, we also, as Steve had noted, this bleeds in with how we're doing net assessment and attribution adjustments as well. So I think a few of the keys to effectively using that field data is really understanding the rules and policies that were in place when the program was setting the baseline activities and pitching a project to a customer, et cetera. Making sure that you have good data collection up front so you don't have large gaps or holes in the necessary data when you need to go back and true up the baseline or the other activities. And of course, you need to have some funds to follow up. So if it's important to get real field information, you're going to need to plan that in your energy efficiency activities to make sure that you have the funds to do that. So this slide really goes to an example of if you don't get your baselines aligned with their policies and the field conditions, end up being different, your field-based results or your savings may not materialize. That's not very fun for anyone. So the example that I share here is from our 2013 custom impact evaluation. Well, it's a little bit difficult to decipher. The categories on the bottom are the different sources of inaccuracies or errors or corrections, depending on the language you want to use, that resulted in the adjustments from the reported savings to the evaluated savings. And if you look at the second set of column, first, the differential in the blue and the orange columns in the front part of that graph, that's related to the baseline specification. And it turned out that that year, the largest driver to missing the projected savings was really setting the baseline correctly. That was 79% of the adjustment was attributable to that factor. It was much smaller than errors in the calculation methods, which was about a 50% attribution, and the operating conditions, which was about 28%. Those two made up less of the difference. And it seems to me that understanding and correcting our baseline specifications or the calculation methods would be things that we can know, correct, and improve on in advance, whereas sometimes the operating conditions are harder to get at. So over time, it would be good for us to be able to improve the estimation of our baseline and true up our calculation methods, and then the uncertainties may be more focused on our operating conditions. So right now we have a handful of ongoing discussions and opportunities that are happening at the Commission. I think it's important to note that we're engaged in an ongoing discussion about baselines, like I noted, at the project level for custom projects, and whenever we have a new measure proposed, we go through that exercise of justifying a baseline. All of this to date has been around our general policies, which have been in place for a while. But last year, we had to pick up the pace on our review of baseline policies that had already started in early 2014-15, but the legislature passed a bill called AB 802, which was adopted at the end of 2015, that allowed the utilities to provide incentives to bring buildings to code as well as exceed code. Now, as I've been saying so far, baselines, et cetera, are complicated, and they depend on the conditions that are being offered and the types of measures and situations, et cetera. And I think that this legislation re-emphasized that the conditions where this specific requirement is or is not appropriate to meet incremental savings objectives of the portfolio, it just really had to be all resolved again. And in order to do that, Energy Division staff worked on a white paper earlier this year that tries to wrangle with the applicability of this legislation and what the changes in default assumptions may be. Now, this is where I have to stop because this is an active proceeding. After the white paper, there's other proceeding activity that is going on, and later this year there should be a decision from the Commission that will redefine our baseline policies and the policy manual and other things will need to be updated. The legislation also adopted the concept of normalized metered energy consumption as a definitional piece of energy savings. So this also kind of assumes that there's a baseline, but we still have to wrangle with all the different four pieces of baselines, which I noted at the beginning of my presentation. And we're doing that right now, but more so at the program level. So what of the enabling legislation allowed for early proposals called the HOPS, High Opportunity Programs and Projects. And these proposals actually include different variations on data and modeling that allow for innovation, but they all have to still deal with baseline policies and concepts and principles that we've been talking about today. So finally, I just wanted to hone in on some ideas for the future. Baselines are foundational to estimating our savings, as Steve pointed out. And I think it's really critical that we take them seriously and we think critically about them. The opportunities that are out there don't really erase the challenges, but it may make some of the aspects of it a little bit easier to deal with. I think our baselines still need to be grounded in the incremental effects of an intervention. They need to reflect the intent of the policies or actions that are funding those interventions. So if it's an incentive program or financing, et cetera, it might be reasonable to have different assumptions around that for where you set your baseline. And then on the points of baseline data, I think that the opportunities for more granular data and more real-time modeling might change some of the dynamics around what types of baselines we're able to set and how we're able to true them up over time to make them more relevant for grid planning, et cetera. And of course, I think baselines should continue to be informed by information gathered from the field and ensure that that is providing an ongoing feedback loop to improving our estimates overall. And that is all I have for today.
Great. Thank you very much, Carmen. I really appreciate your presentation. Somewhat to my surprise, I didn't get too many recommendations for your reading list after you mentioned that the California protocols were one of your favorite things to read, but we'll maybe get some more recommendations as the webinar continues on that. It did have a couple of questions that came in, but I think we might leave them for the end for all of our audience, really tying on that one of the last points you made about data granularity and some of the difficulties of gathering information and how that might be improved in the future to get more timely and more detailed granular estimates on baselines. But now I want to turn to our fourth speaker, Jeff Harris, with the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, NEA. Jeff is NEA's Director of Technology and Market Strategy, where he manages the efforts to build a pipeline of commercially available energy efficiency technologies for the Northwest region. For more than 25 years, Jeff has been at the forefront of Northwest energy efficiency work. Jeff began his career working in energy efficiency R&D projects for the Bonneville Power Administration. And while at NEA, Jeff has also played roles in developing its commercial, residential, and industrial sector market transformation strategies. Jeff's bachelor's and master's degrees are in electrical and mechanical engineering, an interesting combination. And I also want to note that Jeff was recognized for his lifetime contribution to energy efficiency by ACEEE in 2012. So with that, Jeff, if you could take it from there. And you might be on mute. There we go.
I was on mute. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm happy to be here today. And one brief talk about who NEA is. So NEA is, I'm getting ahead of myself. NEA is a nonprofit organization representing the interests of electric utilities in the 4 Northwest states. We use the tool of market transformation to accomplish our mission of advancing energy efficiency in the 4-state region. The thing I'd like to do today is really we're in sort of a unique situation as a regional energy efficiency organization focused on market transformation because we intersect both the world that Rob talked about in terms of market baselines and sort of a power planning and potential standpoint, as well as the world of programs, direct utility acquisition programs, I'll call them, that Carmen and the California utilities work in. So, but the work that we do in market transformation sort of is encompassing of all of that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the first question that I need to talk about is why do we need a baseline in the context of market transformation? It's a little different. I'll talk a little bit about market transformation programs just to give you enough of a flavor to know how they're a little different, and then talk a little bit about establishing and measuring baselines for MT programs with a couple of examples. Okay, so I just talked about who we are. I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. We are funded, I will mention, we're funded by both gas and electric utilities in the 4-state area. So what is market transformation? The definition is on the screen there, and there's a couple of really important words. One is it's a strategic process. So it really is grounded in a high-level view of an entire market. The other word that I'd like to highlight is that this is really about the two words. This is about removing identified barriers or exploiting opportunities to accelerate adoption of all cost-effective energy efficiency. Those phrases, removing barriers or exploiting opportunities, is really the key to what makes market transformation unique. Because we're trying to actually let the market do what it does best, and send the right signals so that the market purchases energy efficiency as a matter of standard practice. The last phrase there in that. So let's talk just a little bit about the context here. Because market transformation programs have this sort of strategic overall view, the questions of why we need a baseline at all is really answerable only in this market transformation context for us. And when we ask that question, really there's sort of two reasons we look for a baseline. One is to estimate the total power system impacts. At the end of the day, what we are trying to do is to advance efficiency to avoid having to buy or build new electricity or gas generating resources. And if we can't figure that out, then we will have no way to avoid the economic and environmental impacts of those resources being built. So it's really important to understand first and foremost what the impact of the various things that we're doing has on the actual power system. Second, there is a regulatory prudency need for a baseline, which is to make sure that we as an organization are using the funds that have been entrusted to us by the regulatory commissions through the utilities in the Northwest are being used in a way that is prudent and grounded ultimately in what is stated here on the slide is design of a market transformation program, which is based on logic of market barriers and market opportunities, as I mentioned before. The last couple of bullets are important to note here. In the world of market transformation, since we're looking at the entire market, and the entire market includes both utility programs and market actors doing things, as well as regulatory functions like codes and standards, all those things are in play in a holistic market view. We're not trying to necessarily sort out why something happened in our market baseline work. That it's really not about attribution. We do spend quite a bit of time trying to sort out to double counting. We don't want to double count any savings that are credited to or counted by utility programs or by a codes and standards effort as distinct from something that our organization might do in its pursuit of changing the market. But we're really not necessarily in the business of trying to figure out exactly at a high level of precision why the whole market changed. And then the last bullet there is, it's already been mentioned several times today, but it's the whole idea of a baseline is that it's counterfactual. And that phrase by itself, to someone coming in from the outside, when they hear that term, it just causes you to pause and scratch your head a little bit. And it should cause all of us to pause and scratch our heads a little bit about why are we spending so much time, in many cases, trying to prove the counterfactual. Well, if depending on the need, as Steve mentioned and Carmen as well, depending on what the need is for, I would say, prudency of using ratepayer-based funds, then the counterfactual can be more important or less. But at the end of the day, what we have to do is create what is in this little picture here in the lower right-hand corner. This is a sort of a picture of what I would call what is known as the holodeck for you Star Trek fans out there. But it's basically we have to simulate a future that didn't happen because we did what we did to intervene in that market. So we have to create some virtual representation of a world that didn't occur. So just keep that in mind when we, as you're thinking about baselines. How much time and resources do you really want to spend on trying to create this alternate universe? Okay, a little bit about market transformation. I mentioned that it's this strategic process, but it's also a long-term view of the entire market. And there's a lot on this slide, and I will try to do my best here to do a quick overview. As we think about markets, this is really, Rob already introduced this idea of diffusion of innovation. And ultimately, energy efficiency has always been about innovation, bringing new products and services that are more efficient than their incumbents and driving them into the market, and that's what drives energy efficiency and energy savings. There's quite a bit of literature on diffusion of innovation that you can look up on the web. We subscribe wholeheartedly to the basic theory. Now, in practice, things don't always work out the way that the theoretical depiction here looks like, but I'll go through this really quickly. Diffusion of innovation says that in almost any new idea that comes into play, it will follow a pretty predictable S-shaped curve, as we call it, often modeled using a Bass diffusion curve. And we would refer to that as our naturally occurring market baseline. So a new technology like a new lighting product or a new motor would have some, in some future, would have some market adoption that would rise slowly to a point of market share that is static at some point and flattens out. Our work in market transformation is to understand what the barriers and opportunities are that will allow us to take that curve and actually accelerate it so that it happens faster than it normally would, and that it actually ultimately stabilizes at a level that is higher. And the difference between these two curves is what we refer to as market transformation. Now, you'll note that we are starting from a fixed point and a fixed market share down here at the bottom of this graph. And that is often referred to in our universe as a frozen efficiency baseline. In other words, the market that we observe here and the market penetration that we observe here is a condition that the electric power system has to provide for today before we get started. And it has a certain market efficiency level. And we can't ever actually really know what is going to happen unless we had this alternate universe. So one measure of baseline for us is this frozen efficiency baseline. And we could measure our success off of that and say that compared to where we started from, we can always measure the exact change in market share of the more efficient technologies and calculate energy savings from that. Now, however, some people would say that, well, that can take a long time since it takes such a long time to change the market, that using the frozen efficiency baseline gets us out of touch with a market that's moving rapidly, as Rob mentioned, like LEDs. And so in our region and in our own practice, we will often reset our baselines to a new frozen efficiency point and use that new frozen efficiency point in load forecasting for power system and energy efficiency potential purposes. And so this is a frozen efficiency baseline with a reset. Both of these views are appropriate for that first question, which is what is the impact of the activities on the overall power system needs and future resource requirements. The natural occurring baseline, which I introduced initially, versus what actually happens, this differential at any point on this graph is really the more appropriate question of, are we making a difference in the market with our market transformation activities, and are we prudently expending ratepayer funds to intervene in this marketplace to drive the market faster and higher than it would be otherwise? So with that as background, and I realize that's a lot to swallow at once, so I will try to refer back to it a little bit. Now, so for any given market that we intervene in, and we establish what the market barriers are all along that S-curve. And we develop at any given point on that graph when we're starting out to intervene in that market and design a program to intervene in that market, we create something called a logic model. And the logic model has barriers and opportunities across the top. It has a series of intervention activities that are related to these barriers and opportunities. And for each of those intervention strategies, we then have a dictated set of outputs that we expect to come out of those intervention strategies, and then a set of market outcomes that would be observable, and that's this middle layer, in the near term, that if our intervention strategies were correctly addressing the market barriers or opportunities, one should be able to trace from a chain of logic from if this is a barrier, we intervene to address that barrier, we see these outcomes from that or outputs from this intervention that drive outcomes that we can measure in the marketplace. We also ultimately are trying to change the entire market, and so we anticipate that there will be medium and longer term outcomes that should also be measurable. Each of these outcomes, near term, medium term, long term, have something called a market progress indicator associated with it that has its own measurement and success factors to see whether or not we're being successful at each stage of the market transformation process, ultimately resulting in full market adoption of the technology if we're successful. Okay, so at one level, baselines really come into play here in establishing first what are the market barriers and opportunities that establish that naturally occurring market S-curve that I showed earlier, and what are the opportunities to drive it higher. So the logic, though, is generally this is what is used to judge prudency, this logic model, and the success or failure of these intervention strategies and whether they were implemented properly is really the primary metric of prudency in market transformation activities. Okay, next slide. So some key considerations for market transformation baselines. One of the things that is changing rapidly for us, as for almost anybody running programs these days, is that markets are moving more and more rapidly. Product cycles are shrinking in time, and so and markets are incredibly dynamic. So we are now moving more and more towards the metric that represents a normalized total market unit energy consumption. So this is very much in line with Rob's market average baselines, the work that he was doing. And it's also, if done properly, almost a direct input into resource planning activities and energy efficiency potential work, because what we are trying to capture here is the entire weighted average market energy intensity for a given product or service in the marketplace. But that has some very significant implications on data requirements, and Carmen alluded to this in her presentation. In order to make this real, we have to have full category sales data, let's say, for consumer products. That means if we really want to use this metric, we have to take full data on all the, let's say, refrigerators. We need to know the average energy intensity of all refrigerators. Well, first we need to know how many refrigerators are being sold into our market. And we need to know the individual energy intensity of each of the products that are being sold in those sales data. And so we have to have really large data sets. And the only place that we get that typically is from actual retailers, to give us the SKU data from the registers, basically, the data that they collect themselves to understand how their markets are moving. That would be for consumer products. As Rob already mentioned, for building stocks or component changes in building stock, we have to have statistical data. That's very expensive. And we do a large stock survey, just as Rob mentioned, once every 5 years in the Northwest, that's supplemented with other data collection on a more frequent basis. Frequency in market is crucial. For fast-moving markets, especially in consumer products, as Rob alluded to, quarterly at a minimum is the frequency that you would need to take these market measurements, and sometimes moving to monthly to understand, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then lastly, if you really are trying to understand, as Carmen alluded to, a key piece of this baseline question is what would happen in the future, and you need some way to forecast that. One way to do that is to have pre-intervention period data that would allow you to establish some kind of a market trend for the efficient products moving into the market. That means that we have to have all of this data that we just talked about for a pre-intervention period, at least 12 months prior to going into the market. An alternate way to do that forecast is to go look for independent market forecasters. Many of the markets that we work in have independent entities that are working on behalf of manufacturers in particular, or component suppliers, that are also trying to guess where the market will move. And these are effectively not thinking about the utility program world, and so they represent a great third-party independent source of what market trends would be. But that data is often not cheap either. Lastly, I think there's the sequence and priority. From our perspective, since what we're really trying to do is avoid having to buy or purchase new electric resources in our region, the first priority is really to get the total market change correct. On that S-curve, we're not so concerned about the naturally occurring baseline, but really we want to know, where is the market today? What is its energy intensity right now, and where is it headed? Let's get that right, because that's the thing that ultimately will drive new loads. Secondly, though, then we can worry about the alternate universe and go access some of these other sources of data to actually try to project this naturally occurring baseline. There is a third use of this baseline data, and that has to do with helping us understand what market barriers remain. So, but we can also get some of that data through independent market research that doesn't require quite as much cost.
Jeff?
I'm going to be running. Yep.
Steve, sorry, we're running a little tight on time here. I know you have a couple of examples, but maybe we can leave these example slides for the audience, and if you could maybe quickly summarize on your last slide, and then we can get to some of the questions. We'll probably run over about 5 minutes.
I will do that. Let me just skip to the slides that I just slipped through are some actual market diffusion curves that we have actually measured over time as programs have been implemented, market transformation programs. The two slides to this one represented an interesting exercise. Sometimes we can't actually trend data, we can't because it's not available, or we can't get it from an independent market research firm. And we have used frequently Delphi panels of market experts to do the same forecasting exercise. And that has turned out to be very challenging because there's a requirement for Delphi to work that requires convergence, and we don't always see that. So my conclusions: market transformation programs are different. They require some unique approaches that have really significant impacts for data requirements. But before we go measure anything, we really need to understand, why are we measuring it? Is it really about loads and future resources, or is it about prudency, or both? Delphi panels are not always reliable. It's been challenging. So at this point in time, we are leading more towards markets where we can get full category sales data, and so we can actually real-time measure what's happening. Other than the frozen efficiency estimates, market baselines are inherently uncertain. So really need to ask, how important are they for prudency compared to using these other techniques which focus more on market progress indicators? And with that, I'll finish.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much. So we're at the scheduled end time for our webinar here, but if I could call on the patience of our audience and our speakers, then we can go on for 5 minutes or so. There's a couple of questions that I've tried to group together from our audience that I wasn't able to respond via the text boxes. The first one, to maybe get a 1 minute quick response from each of our speakers who might want to, is about the issues around getting more data. How do you see the changes happening to improve establishing baselines, using more granular data, more available data, getting better at our estimates of baselines and more speedy evaluations? Do you see things changing based on changing marketplace practices or data collection? And each of you, I know Carmen, you spend a lot of time on the data issues. I don't know if you want to taking a first shot at that, then Rob or Jeff, if you have anything to add. Where do you see things changing?
Well, I think that some of the areas where I'm back to my future forecast, if you will, I think that there might be more opportunities to see that kind of ongoing true-up of baselines for continued interventions. The strategic energy management strategies, for example, could be ways that you are having more of that ongoing assessment of what your baseline is when you start the intervention and then truing it up over time. And that's still I don't know where that's going to land yet, but I think it might prove to be helpful for better integration for large customers into more grid planning strategies to be able to kind of track those incremental interventions over time and have more of a partnership relationship for their efficiency actions rather than a snapshot in time to do a large intervention, then post the savings and then go back again and again. So that's one concept that I'm hopeful will be able to take shape with more provision of data.
So Rob or Jeff?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there on what Carmen described there with strategic energy management is actually a form of program design in a sense where the program itself generates the data that you need to establish a starting point, sort of a built-in measurement system that gives you the baseline before intervention. And I see more and more with the amount of networked controls and connected equipment, it's actually more and more possible now to use the actual measure itself to generate the baseline data and then to generate the actual measurement of savings. And that's not just from a technology standpoint, but also from a market standpoint, as I mentioned. If we're trying to work on changing the markets for a given appliance or something like that, getting the retail sales category data and connecting with that in almost a real-time basis gives you that continuous improvement and measurement that you need to make things better going forward. Right, I see that happening more and more as we go forward.
Rob, I don't know if there's things happening in Michigan in terms of data collection and
Steve, I think the issue isn't so much collecting more data, but being smarter. The more aggressive federal appliance efficiency standards are really making it more and more difficult for utilities to meet their targets. They're reducing program savings and making budgets more and more tight. So the amount of money available for EM&V, is shrinking. And so I think what we really need to do is be smarter and frugal. And what we're really doing is trying to focus on those measures that have the largest impact or just a larger component of spending for the programs, and really focus on those for EM&V work. So that's just my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came in, perhaps for each of you, is the attribution issue, or the what's happening with baselines in that, there might be a market transformation program or multiple incentive programs taking place or financing programs, other efforts that can cause, cause people to take actions, and these can be overlapping and potential for double counting if you're not taking into account these other activities and baselines, but there are many overlapping things over periods of time. Is, maybe starting with Jeff in terms of, the utilities in the Northwest with your market transformation programs. Is there the potential for double counting, or in Michigan and California, how you look at trying to establish the baselines when there's many influences and incentive type activities for efficiency?
Well, in the Northwest, almost most of the utilities in the Northwest in their own programs where we intersect are operating on a gross savings measurement approach. And so they're measuring savings off of a fixed baseline, a frozen efficiency baseline. And so what we do in the Northwest is we simply try to track as best as we can savings that are being counted by utilities under that metric and subtract those units that are installed out of the total market units that we're measuring at the whole market level, and making sure that we are not first double counting. We don't want to double count. That's sort of the first thing we're trying to accomplish. And then the question of how do the utility programs reflect the naturally occurring baseline that I mentioned is something that we actually stay out of that and let the individual utility programs, which have prudency reviews by the different regulatory agencies in the 4 states, that's a conversation between the regulator and the program administrator at the utility. But it is having a gross savings methodology in most of the 4 state areas makes that conversation relatively straightforward. It's simply a question of what did they put in their potential study, and are they using the same rules and assumptions for their measurement of savings that they put into their potential studies. And then those potential studies get reset very frequently.
Yeah, Carmen or Rob, I don't know if you have anything you might want to add probably for our last question here.
This is Carmen. I would just say that the double counting on codes and standards is a particular area of focus on our most recent adjustment to baseline situations because of the legislation calling for allowing for incentives up to code. We have a history of very aggressive codes and standards in California, and also an advocacy role for our investor-owned utilities, for which they get savings credit. So trying to not only parse those out for understanding where that should be showing up in the forecast, but also how you should be designing programs to get at the incremental effect of keeping people moving above code is kind of the focal point of the white paper that I referenced in my discussion.
Okay. Rob, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there, or
yeah, Steve. One of the issues that we've been thinking about is just the idea of compliance with the codes. I mean, you can have a code, but if you're not having 100% compliance with the code, there's an opportunity for utilities through their efficiency programs possibly to partner with local government or state government in enforcing codes to get the codes enforced to move toward 100% compliance. And that would be something that the utilities could get credit for, the attribution toward their programs.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our speakers, particularly for staying with us for an extra 10 minutes, and for our audience. Very much appreciated. Hopefully this was helpful and informative. As you can see here, the webinar will be posted on our website, and there will be additional webinars coming forward. And with that, I want to again thank the Department of Energy's Transmission Planning and Technical Assistance Division for the funding of this effort, and wish our speakers and our audience a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time.